Want to make your seed starting timeline easy this year? Me too. Let's go. Hey friends, it's Kendall, your joyful farmer. This video is all about when to start your seeds for the spring. Every month on YouTube, I see a lot of videos that tell you what seeds to start in that particular month. And that might help if the person lives in your area, but more than likely, you're gonna need some more specific advice for your timeline based on your estimated last frost date. Today, I'm gonna give you exactly that. I'm gonna show you how I sort my seeds once in the winter so that I'm prepared for the whole growing season. Then I can just grab them and start them at the right time and get the earliest harvest possible. And the best part is this calendar will work for you too. Virtually anywhere you have a frost-free growing season, whether that season is 2 months long or 10 months long. It's specific to the beginning of your growing season, and the timeline is based on getting the plants grown and in the ground as soon as it's possible for them. This method makes my life so much easier and takes away any guesswork or thinking later on in the season, so hopefully it'll help you as well. So I'm going to show you how I sort my seeds, give you some free printable notes, and also give you a calendar for transplanting things out. And I'm going to show you how to apply it to your growing location. Easy peasy. A seed starting calendar is a really important tool. It'll help you sort your seeds by each species and when they can be grown out and transplanted out into the garden. There's a real Goldilocks principle to seed starting. You don't want to start them too early, and most people don't want to get behind and start them too late either. I would venture to say that most people who garden want a harvest as early as possible in the season, and the information I'm going to give you today will help you to do just that. It'll help you get the earliest possible harvests and also be as successful as possible. Different regions and climates have different time and temperature constraints when it comes to growing and successfully harvesting specific vegetables. For example, here in North Texas and many areas in the southern US, although our frost-free growing season is about 6 months long, and that sounds like a long amount of time, we have a short spring, a long hot summer, and a very short fall, which affects what and how we can grow specific plants. And that hot summer that gets into the triple digits Fahrenheit will certainly limit what we can grow in the summertime. In northern US climates, the frost-free growing season can be really short, more like from May to September, which is about 3 months. And in both of these scenarios, it's helpful to start seeds as early as possible in the later winter and early spring so that you can get an early and more prolonged harvest than you would if you started your seeds later. And then of course there are some more coastal areas that have a more temperate climate the majority of the year, and they have a nice, long, mild growing season. And we're happy for those people. There are pros and cons to every different location, and we each just have to make the most of the climate that we have. So the key piece of information that you're gonna need to start your seeds is your last estimated frost date in the spring. Farmer's Almanac is a good online resource to find yours if you don't already know it. And then what I will do is I will group the seeds by the window of time that they should ideally be started. I'll put them together in a Ziploc bag or even in a rubber band to group them together, and I will label the bag with the week that I need to remember to start them indoors in the greenhouse or direct sow them out into the garden. And this year I have some printable cheat sheets, which are going to make my life and hopefully yours even easier. All you have to do is print them, use my link to calculate the date for each group of seeds, and boom, the hardest work of sorting your seeds is done. And I do also have a super easy calculator that's linked in that document that I made using a spreadsheet that will help you easily count backwards and mark your specific dates on your groups of seeds. So let's walk through each window of time and talk about which seeds you should start during that time frame. I'll also offer you the rationale and some helpful tips for some of them as well. These are specifically the vegetable, fruit, and herb seeds, and I'll be sharing the flower seed timeline in another video. Starting at 12 weeks before your estimated last frost date, there are some seeds that you can absolutely start indoors. Celery. Celery has a long growth cycle, up to 140 days to maturity. Because of that long growth cycle, you really need to get it started early. Celeriac is a type of celery grown for its baseball-sized, nut-flavored roots, and that one you also should start early, and either of those you should set out after the temperature reaches 55 degrees in the spring. Asparagus. While people typically grow it from one-year-old crowns or asparagus roots, it can also be started from seed. It'll take you an extra year to grow those asparagus out so that they can be harvested, but they're super easy to start from seed. Once established, asparagus is fairly hardy and it's perennial in a lot of zones and will come back year after year, but as young seedlings, they kind of do need to be protected from frost. Stevia. Stevia is super slow to germinate. It can take 3 weeks, so you want to get it started early. Stevia does appreciate cold stratification, so a couple of weeks of a cold period by putting them in a fridge or a freezer can really help to improve the germination rates. Rosemary. Rosemary is also very slow to germinate. It can take 4 weeks or even longer to germinate, and it also benefits from cold stratification. With either of these, rosemary or stevia, if you're already 12 weeks out from your last frost date, I would still cold stratify your seeds for at least a week or two before sowing them, and make sure that you sow them on the surface of the soil when you do that to give them light to help them to germinate. Parsley. Parsley is somewhat slow growing, but it's also very cold tolerant, which means that you can get it started this early because you can also get it planted out early. You can plant it out before your last frost even gets here. Onions. Onions can be started from seed up to 14 weeks before your last estimated frost date, and that's because you can plant onions out 4 weeks before your last estimated frost date. They can tolerate quite a bit of cold. Many people plant out onion starts, plants that have already been started for them, but onions are super easy to grow from seed and pretty forgiving, so I always encourage people to try to grow them from seed. Leeks. Leeks can be multi-sown, which means you can put 3 or 4 seeds per cell or container to be transplanted out a couple of weeks before your last frost. They're a little bit slower to grow, so you can get a real head start on them by sowing them early indoors. So any of these plants are the ones that I try to get started the 12th week or the 11th week before my last frost. Next is 10 weeks before the estimated last frost date. Most of these are cool-loving crops. Brussels sprouts. Many varieties of Brussels sprouts need up to 110, even 120 days or more to reach maturity so that you can harvest Brussels sprouts from them. So I would definitely recommend starting them this early. You can plant them out a couple of weeks before your last frost date. Peas. Snap peas and English peas are both very cold tolerant, and Johnny's actually says that you can plant them out up to 6 to 8 weeks before your last estimated frost date. They normally prefer to be direct sown, but you can get an early start on them by starting them 3 to 4 weeks early before planting them out, or somewhere around the 10-week mark. You do have to transplant them carefully as they don't like their roots disturbed, and I've also found that they transplant well if you start them in soil blocks. Spinach or auric. Spinach can also be planted out 3 to 6 weeks before your last frost, and because of that, you can start it in that 10-week time frame as well. Some others in this 10-week group are kale, cabbage, collards, kohlrabi, and mustard greens. Similarly to spinach, they can be planted out pretty early, so you can start them in this time frame. Kohlrabi and mustard in particular typically like to be direct sown, but I have transplanted them out many times with success. Then we have herbs such as oregano, sage, thyme, chives, lemon balm, lavender, mint, and bee balm, also called bergamot or lemon mint. And all of those herbs are going to benefit from a week, 2 weeks of cold stratification. Now these herbs in many zones are perennial plants, so I will oftentimes winter sow them with great success. I will link a video all about the method of winter sowing in the description below. You may want to check it out because it saves some greenhouse or indoor growing space, and it works especially well for perennial plants. Also in this 10-week group are eggplant and super hot peppers. So both of these are nightshades and they're slower to germinate and grow compared to the other nightshades. In this group, I would include any variety of eggplant and then also any variety of super hot chili pepper like ghost peppers, reapers, butlas. I would even include habaneros in this group just because they're slower growing peppers. Eggplants and peppers really do like heat to germinate, so they will really appreciate a heat mat or even a small makeshift germination chamber. I have a video also for one of those that I'll link below, and that really helps them to germinate quickly. I don't put bell peppers, sweet peppers, or jalapenos in this group, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Now with these bundles of seeds, I do try to get them started that week or the following week, but if I run out of time or forget to start something, it's really not the end of the world. I'll typically just put what is left in the one bag into the next bag in sequence. Like if I didn't get to my eggplant in the 10th or 9th week, I'll just take that Ziploc bag or those seeds and I'll tuck them into the next one. And that reminds me to start those first during the next round of seed starting. These really are all just general guidelines to help you get the earliest harvest. So if you're a little bit delayed, it's really nothing to worry about. 8 weeks. This is a very full seed starting time frame. Let's talk about the cool loving veggies first. We have broccoli, broccolini, cauliflower, cabbage, Swiss chard, beets, rutabaga, and turnip. All of those can be planted out around 2 weeks before your last frost date, so they can be effectively started up to 6 weeks prior to that indoors. Turnip, rutabagas, and beets tend to prefer to be direct sown, but if you carefully transplant them, those tend to work out. Beets can be multi-sown in clusters of 3 to 4 seeds in a cell, and they can be transplanted out all together like that. Soil blocks or smaller 2-inch cells would be a really great way to grow them as transplants, just so that the taproot system is more resilient at transplant. Artichoke. It's generally recommended that you start artichokes 8 weeks prior to your last frost date and then plant them out right after your last frost date. And here I would also add dill. Although dill doesn't really prefer to be transplanted, this is the window in which I would start the dill that I want to grow out early in transplant. Now for the warm loving plants. I love tomatoes and grow all different varieties. Getting a head start on tomatoes is often helpful in cooler climates and warmer climates because they're frost tender, but also many varieties of tomatoes tend to drop their blooms when the soil temperature reaches 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius. And that's also typically when outside temperatures get above 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius. There's a lot of tomatoes in here. Some heirloom tomatoes, I'll actually prioritize starting at 8 weeks before our last frost because they tend to quit producing tomatoes earlier than some of the others. So I'll tend to do all of the heirlooms first, along with any of the larger slicing tomatoes. And if I had to prioritize and choose tomatoes that I had to start 6 weeks before last frost, I would probably choose cherry tomatoes because they tend to produce longer in the summer than slicers. Determinate tomatoes or paste tomatoes, I will typically start at 8 weeks just so that I can get a jump on a bumper crop of tomatoes. Then there are peppers. All of the bell peppers, jalapenos, poblanos, and serranos, I would put in this category. They grow faster than the super hot peppers and need less time to grow out to full-size transplants. Tomatoes and peppers both love very warm soil, so at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. That warm soil really helps them to grow their roots quickly and not have their roots shocked when they're transplanted into the ground. The timing on tomatoes and peppers I've found over the years to be very important. I want to explain the reasoning here. While it might seem counterintuitive, it's not always the best to have the largest possible mature plants when planting out into the garden. It can actually be harder for more mature plants to become established in the soil, and they can expend a lot of energy doing so. And that can sometimes stunt their growth for an extra week or so. If transplants are 6 to 7 weeks in age, those slightly smaller plants tend to adapt more quickly to their new garden soil, and they'll often get a boost in growth before those more mature plants do. Mature plants may give you a little bit of fruit sooner, but I've found that it can take them longer to get a real boost in growth and start to produce more. Once years ago, I planted out a really big tomato plant that I paid $10 for at the hardware store back in the day when plants didn't cost quite so much. It was a huge tomato plant. But a volunteer tomato plant sprouted next to it in the garden. It was just a seed that had been left behind the year before that had germinated, grew, and it actually overtook the mature plant rather quickly and outproduced it. But with pepper plants, especially, slightly smaller transplants planted into warmer soil a couple of weeks after the last frost tend to actually take off and grow really quickly. So that's the rationale I have for starting tomatoes and peppers at 8 weeks before last frost rather than 10 or 12 weeks before last frost. Next is roselle. I love growing roselle for tea. It's in the mallow family and it's actually a relative of okra, so it's a heat-loving plant, but it does take longer to get growing and it doesn't produce those calyxes that you use for the tea until later into the fall as the day length gets shorter again. So roselle does benefit from being started in this time frame, and you can carefully transplant it after last frost. Before I go any further, if you're finding value in this content, I would love it if you would consider liking, subscribing, or sharing it with someone who could benefit from it so that we can help more people to find more joy in growing. Also, I do have the totally free printables linked in the description below, those specific lists of seeds with notes that you can print, cut out, and bundle with your seeds so that you can sort them in the winter and be ready to start those seeds whenever the time comes. I also have the transplanting calendar that you can print and fill in your weeks according to your last frost date to take all of the guesswork out and make life easy. 6 weeks before last frost, basil. I grow all sorts of basils, and a 6-week-old basil plant tends to be a great size for transplanting out. This year I'm actually probably going to grow my lemon and lime basil at 8 weeks because they're slower to grow than the other basils. Basil really appreciates supplemental heat from a heat mat in order to germinate well and germinate quickly. Lemongrass. Lemongrass can be sown directly outdoors after last frost, but you also can start it early, and it, like basil, does like supplemental heat for germination. Some other herbs that I would start during this window are fennel, lovage, and savory. I'll also mention here that this time frame is the typical time frame for planting out spring potatoes from seed potatoes, not from seed. I'm not going to put seed potatoes in this bag. But it is a good reminder about the timing for potato planting. Here in the southern US, it's traditionally right around Valentine's Day. I will cut them up and allow the cut faces to cure for about a week before I plant them out. 2 to 4 weeks before last frost. This is a time frame that includes a lot of larger seeds, which also means larger seedlings and heat-loving vegetables. So this is when I start cucurbits from seed that I want to get a head start on. Some people will tell you that you shouldn't start cucurbits early and transplant them, but I've done this for years, and in my experience, I get about 2 to 3 weeks of a head start on harvests by doing this. Cucumber, Armenian cucumber, melons like cantaloupe or muskmelon, watermelon, winter squash like butternut squash, spaghetti squash, or pumpkins, summer squash, zucchini squash, or courgettes, and also gourds like loofah, birdhouse gourd, or gugutsa gourd, or tromboncino squash, also called rampicante squash. All of these I will start in this time frame, but I will carefully transplant them out, especially the cucumbers, only when the soil warms to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 16 degrees Celsius, which is usually a week or 2 after our last frost. These are all larger seeds with larger seedlings that grow quickly into larger baby plants, and in my experience, they really don't benefit from being started any sooner and getting any larger in their cells or containers before being planted out. So 2 to 4 weeks before last frost, I've found is the right time for these guys. Okra. Okra is a heat-loving crop that usually likes to be direct sown, but it can be carefully transplanted when plants are 4 to 5 weeks old and when the soil is, again, 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 16 degrees Celsius. Also on this list is corn. I hear that you can start corn indoors or in a greenhouse from seed and then transplant it out. I've never actually tried it because I've always direct sown it, but I do know people who have done it successfully. This includes all the different corns like sweet corn, field corn, and popcorn. My last 2 groups are what can be direct sown. Most of these you can get a head start on by transplanting in order to get a harvest a couple of weeks sooner than you would if you're direct sowing them. But I mention this because you might want to direct sow these instead of transplanting them, just out of sheer convenience. Direct sowing is just one step of sowing the seed in the soil outside, and sowing and caring for transplants and then hardening them off and planting them out, that's a lot of work. Also, when you direct sow any of these crops in addition to transplanting them, what results is succession sowing. When your transplants stop producing, you'll have another round of veggies that are growing and coming up that you can enjoy. When direct sowing, I typically sow twice the number of seeds that I would when starting indoors or in a greenhouse. And this is because with direct sowing, it can often result in more spotty germination and also more loss of seeds and seedlings due to critters like birds, rodents, or rabbits. The first group that you can direct sow outside is when your soil is cooler than 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 16 degrees Celsius. And you can also do this as early as 4 weeks before your last frost date. Things like dill, cilantro, parsley, lettuce, spinach, orech, kale, kohlrabi, peas, sprouting or early varieties of broccoli, beets, turnips, and all of those were in a prior group, but you can take those seeds out of that bag after you transplant them, and you can put them in this bag so that you can direct sow them as well. Radishes are also in this group. The days to maturity on radishes is so short, like 3 weeks or so, that it's never been worth it to me to do the work of starting radishes indoors and then transplanting them out. They're such a quick turnaround when you direct sow them in the ground. And if you live in an area where your summers are cool, you probably could get away with direct sowing things like cauliflower, cabbage, broccoli, rutabagas, even maybe even Brussels sprouts, because you have such a nice long cool growing season. In the warmer southern US, we don't typically have enough time to do this before the heat hits. Brassicas will often bolt and go to seed in the spring before we can get a harvest off of them due to the warmer days outside. So it's best that we here in the South start them as early as possible in the spring. But if you're in a cooler climate, you probably can direct sow all of these in this bag that I mentioned. And then there's the bag of what you can sow after the last frost, or when the soil is at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. And here I have basil. Basil reseeds readily and does very well direct sown. Then you have all the beans. So bush beans, pole beans, and noodle beans, or long beans, they're also called. I would not recommend starting beans indoors. It's just something that I've never been successful with. They've always done very well for me direct sown. If you sow them too early into cool soil, you're pretty much guaranteed to have germination issues. They really prefer to be direct sown in warm soil. You could even wait another week or two after your last frost until when the soil is 65 degrees Fahrenheit or 18 degrees Celsius. And I do soak all of my bean seeds overnight before I direct sow them in the garden, just because we do live in a little bit of a drier climate here, and it helps them to get a head start on germination. Also in this bag, I have all of the cucurbits again. So cucumbers, summer and winter squash, melons, watermelon, gourds, pumpkins, all of those things. They do love to be direct sown in warm soil. I find that they often will catch up with transplants that are 4 to 6 weeks older and sometimes produce only like 1 to 3 weeks behind the ones that I started in the greenhouse or indoors and planted out. But again, it's a great way to succession sow them, to have additional plants when your indoor or greenhouse grown plants start to peter out. A lot of times I'll just take a packet of seeds out with me when I'm transplanting, and I will pop the seeds into empty soil as I'm transplanting the plants. Super easy. Okra. Okra is also one of the heat-loving plants that does very well direct sown in warm soil. I do like to soak those seeds overnight before sowing them. And there's corn. I will pre-soak my corn seeds and direct sow them into warm soil as well. And also in this time frame, I went ahead and put cow peas, also called field peas or black-eyed peas, or you might know them as southern peas. These are most commonly grown in the southern US because they thrive in our hot summers. They need soil to be 65 to 70 degrees to germinate well, and pre-soaking really does help them with germination as well. But they're a great heat-loving crop to grow. And the last thing I'll include in this category is sweet potatoes, which are grown from slips, not seeds. But they do prefer to be planted out around the same time that you would plant your cowpeas, and they like warm soil as well. Some people will even plant sweet potatoes after they harvest their regular potatoes or spring potatoes. And I just thought I'd include that reminder of planting sweet potatoes on this list as well. And if you get through all of your bundles of seeds and you still have seeds left, my advice would be to direct sow them anyway and see what happens. Even if you don't get the earliest harvest or get the most out of your plants, it's equally as important to me as a grower to harvest those lessons that you learn along the way. These guidelines are just generally the way to get the earliest possible harvests in the spring. So all that said, my advice is not to obsess over the timeline so much that it stresses you out or steals your joy. So check out the easy lists for seed starting and the transplanting calendar. Again, they're linked in the video's description below. I hope they'll be beneficial to you this year. I know they will be for me. And I'll also link the flower seed starting calendar when that video is posted as well. So how do you like to organize yourself for seed starting, and what sort of lessons have you learned about the process of starting from seed? I would love to hear your thoughts or questions or comments below. I wish you joy and all of the green things this year, and I'll see you next time.